Hey guys, let's talk about the works of Junji Ito. If you're watching this video and you're into anime, you've probably at least heard this gentleman's name by now. But just in case you haven't, Mr. Ito is probably the most famous and well-respected artist of horror manga alive today. Some of his most beloved works are Tomie, a story about a femme fatale who's literally the walking embodiment of toxic femininity, and Uzumaki, a tale about a small town cursed by the hypnotic shape of the spiral. It's pretty weird stuff. Over the past few years, Junji Ito's works have been gaining quite a bit of traction worldwide, and we've seen several anime adaptations of some of his most iconic stories. Back in 2018, we got the Junji Ito Collection, which was an anthology series based on some of his best-known short stories, and later this year Adult Swim is planning to put out an animated adaptation of Uzumaki. I'm particularly excited about this anime because I've been a fan of Junji Ito for about 10 years now, and Uzumaki was the manga that first introduced me to his works. I've read a few others since, like Tomie, Gyo, Smashed, Shiver, and Venus in the Blind Spot, and one thing I've noticed is that while Junji Ito is most celebrated for his horror stories, a lot of his works would actually be more accurately described as dark comedies. This leads us to today's subject, the 2023 Netflix series called Junji Ito Maniac: Japanese Tales of the Macabre. I recently saw this anthology series for the first time, and to be honest, it kind of left me scratching my head. Like a lot of Junji Ito's material, this collection was marketed very much as a series of horror stories, but by the time I'd finished with the last episode, I was genuinely beginning to second guess whether or not I'd mistaken which genre this show was meant to fall under. I even ended up looking up the word macabre just to make sure I understood it properly. That's how pedantic this series made me. And just for the record, the word macabre apparently has 3 definitions: having death as a subject, dwelling on the gruesome, and tending to produce horror in a beholder. So yeah, when a show is titled Japanese Tales of the Macabre, I think it's reasonable for viewers to expect to be scared. But how effective is the show? Well, let's take a look and find out. I actually have not read the manga versions of most of the stories featured in this anime, so I'd be very curious to hear from you guys who have read them whether or not you thought the anime versions held up. Oh, and there are going to be spoilers from here on out, so fair warning. Alright, so the first story in the collection should really set the tone for the rest of the series, right? And in this case, it honestly kind of does, unfortunately. Episode 1 is called The Strange Hikizuri Siblings, and in my opinion, it's the weakest in the bunch. The story follows a group of siblings who have recently lost their parents. The oldest brother of the group happens upon a lovely young woman who's interested in the paranormal, and so in order to get closer to her, he stages a seance and attempts to summon his parents' spirits. The seance appears to succeed since the father's spirit inhabits one of the siblings' bodies, but we learn fairly quickly that the whole thing was a hoax. The episode then ends with one of the youngest siblings accidentally channeling their father's spirit for real, much to the surprise and comedic, quote-unquote, terror of the group. I will say, when it comes to the animation, you can definitely tell that this series had a higher budget than the 2018 show did. But unfortunately, decent animation can't save bad writing. I haven't read this particular story, so I'm not sure how faithful of an adaptation this is, but the idea of a fake seance turning a little too real is one that I've seen before in the horror genre, and executed much better. Even the money shot depicting the father's angry spirit spreading throughout the house just comes across as more goofy than disturbing. Plus, since the episode ends with the father's spirit just returning to its grave without really doing anything, there's nothing here to frighten the audience. But what's more painful than anything is the bad comedy. I mean, based on the way the episode plays out, the framing makes it pretty clear that we're supposed to find the whole thing funny, but it really ends up just making you cringe. I mean, bad horror is one thing, but bad comedy is just excruciating. Honestly, I don't think I'll ever understand why this specific story was chosen to be the flagship episode. It's not scary, it's not funny, and nothing about it is particularly charming. But then again, I could say that for quite a few stories in this collection. Episode 2 is comprised of 2 stories: Ice Cream Bus and The Story of the Mysterious Tunnel. Ice Cream Bus is the shorter of the pair and is played like a straight-up horror. The premise is that a mysterious bus appears in a certain neighborhood selling ice cream and giving the neighborhood children rides around town. At the end, it turns out that the bus is turning children into ice cream. Is it weird? Sure. Is it predictable? Kind of. Is it scary? Definitely not. I mean, I guess it would be if it happened in real life, but honestly, knowing what I do about Junji Ito's better stories, I was really expecting something a lot more shocking and horrific than we get with this one. I mean, I guess we do get to see someone's head fall off at the end, though, so there's that. As for the story of the mysterious tunnel, this was probably my favorite tale so far. The premise of this one is that a young boy sees his mother disappear into a mysterious tunnel, only to later find that his entire family is being drawn to their doom at the same place. I think that part of what made this one work a little better was that the tone felt more focused than it did in the first couple of stories, and there's a genuine mystery that's built up around what's lurking beyond the tunnel entrance. As it turns out, there's a research laboratory deep inside, and the doctors who are studying there reveal that there are cosmic rays passing through the mountain above straight into the tunnel. At the climax of the story, we see the doctors and the young boy's family all sinking into the walls and floor of the tunnel, I guess implying that the cosmic rays have altered their bodies so that they're able to pass through solid matter just like the rays do. The process ends up killing them all, and the story concludes with our child protagonist also being altered by the cosmic rays. Overall, it's not a perfect story, and I can't say it scared me, but like I said, it does at least have an interesting premise. There's a bit of a Lovecraftian vibe to the whole thing with the horror coming from beyond the stars, and I do like how dark the ending is. Unfortunately, this story is followed up by one of the worst in the series. Episode 3 is titled Hanging Balloon, and this is the first entry in the series that I've actually read. I can't remember which manga collection this story was originally published in, but one thing I do remember while reading it was thinking that it had to have one of the dumbest premises I've ever heard, especially for a horror story. And I don't mean any offense to Junji Ito, it's just that I don't see this premise working in any medium. The story of Hanging Balloon kicks off with a young idol hanging herself. After her death, people start to see a giant balloon of her head floating around town. More balloon versions of people's heads begin to appear afterward, attached to nooses, and the story basically becomes a tale of the invasion of the balloon heads as they float around trying to hang people by their nooses. And I don't know what to say about this. Do you find this premise scary? Is it funny? I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling right now, guys. I guess that somebody behind the scenes must have really believed in this story because it takes up an entire episode on its own, and there is at least a decent amount of tension and build up to the horror. I even think that the balloons look sufficiently creepy for what they are. But again, the premise is just so ridiculous that I can't take any of this seriously. And speaking of not being able to take things seriously, episode 4 begins with a Soichi story. We actually get 2 Soichi tales in this collection, and if I'm being honest, I do kind of like the Soichi character. For those who don't know, the idea behind this guy is that he's a weird, gloomy kid with the supernatural ability to curse people. I think what I like about this character is that he's basically a reverse Light Yagami. In Death Note, part of what makes the story so interesting is that Light is anything but an ordinary teenager. Part of this is due to the influence of the Death Note, but partly Light is just an extremely intelligent, calculating person with a strong drive to improve the world. At least in the way he sees it. As for Soichi, he's a kid with extraordinary abilities, but his goals are very mundane. While Light is out there trying to end crime by proving the existence of Kira, Soichi is using his abilities to get back at kids he's jealous of in school, or to annoy his siblings, or to get praise from his teacher. He's a nasty little booger whose malevolence is just barely outweighed by his bad luck and incompetence. He might actually be a danger to society if any of his curses ended up hurting anyone other than himself. In case it's not clear yet, Soichi is definitely more of a comedic character than a horrific one. And while the stories involving him can be pretty hit and miss, I actually think that they do a better job than a lot of other Junji Ito stories of mingling horror elements with effective humor. But with all that being said, the story we get in this particular episode is probably one of Soichi's worst. It's titled 4x4 Walls, and the premise is that Soichi keeps annoying his older brother, so their father calls in a carpenter to soundproof the older brother's room. But Soichi ends up helping the carpenter with his work, and the pair create a series of crawl spaces all around the room that Soichi is able to use to further annoy his brother. That's it. That's the whole story. So, not one of the best. As I mentioned, we do get another Soichi story in this collection, but we'll get to that one when we get to it. The second story that we get in episode 4 is called The Sandman's Lair. This is a brief tale about a man who insists he can't fall asleep because he's convinced that his dream self is trying to take over his body. His girlfriend, although not fully convinced, agrees to help him with his dilemma. She spends the night at his place, promising to look out for him, but after she ends up accidentally nodding off, she awakens to find someone trying to escape from her boyfriend's body. As it turns out, the man's dream self is trying to get out by turning his body inside out. His girlfriend points out that bodies are full of organs, so that should be impossible, but this is the man's reply. Oh. Okay. Now it makes perfect sense. Anyway, the guy ends up falling asleep, and then this happens. And that's basically the end of the story. The dream guy ends up escaping while the original and his girlfriend are, I guess, sucked into the dream world. It's a mildly disturbing scenario, but given that the whole story only runs about 10 minutes long, the pacing is a bit too quick to build up a proper feeling of dread. And things get so crazy so quickly that you're barely able to register what's happening before the episode is over. So yeah, again, not one of my favorites. Episode 5 includes the stories Intruder and Long Hair in the Attic. Intruder is one story that I completely forgot about until I sat down to do this video, so that alone should tell you something. As the story goes, there's a kid named Oshikiri who hears strange sounds in his house at night. He invites some classmates over who are interested in the paranormal, and the four of them end up seeing an Oshikiri from another dimension. It's kind of weird how blasé the characters end up being about the whole situation. Like, at one point one of them just claims that he's sensing a person from another dimension, and none of his friends act like that's a particularly strange thing to be saying or thinking. When the characters do see the Oshikiri from another dimension, they discover that he's apparently murdered all of their counterparts from his dimension, and is using this dimension to hide their bodies. The other Oshikiri flees before he's done burying the last body, and the episode ends with our main foursome doing all they can to hide the bodies so that this dimension's Oshikiri doesn't get into any trouble for their murders. And I guess the idea of helping to bury your own body could be disturbing, but the build-up and execution of the story just didn't leave me feeling much of anything. I am pretty sure that this Oshikiri character and his house are part of a larger set of stories, but again, I forgot all about them until making this video, so take that for what it's worth. The second story in this episode is a lot better in my opinion, but my one big gripe with it is that the title is kind of a major spoiler. The story is called Long Hair in the Attic, so as you're sitting watching it, you're just waiting for that money shot where we get to see the creepy long hair in the attic. The story opens with the main character, Chiyomi, getting dumped by her boyfriend. As it turns out, the pair had been dating for almost a decade, and Chiyomi had even grown her hair out for him, but her ex proves to be a pretty insensitive jerk who doesn't even remember asking her to grow it out. Chiyomi spends the night crying over the dirtbag, and the next morning finds a dead rat tangled in her hair. Announcing that that's the last straw, she decides to cut her hair off. And this is where things get weird. While her sister goes to fetch a pair of scissors to help her, she hears a scream coming from Chiyomi's room and returns to find her dead with her head missing. How did she die? Never explained. A short while after the funeral, Chiyomi's sister and father head up to the attic to make sure there are no more rats, but they end up coming across Chiyomi's severed head suspended by her hair. The head untangles itself, and then the hair crawls down from the attic, dragging the severed head out the door. The story ends with a shot of Chiyomi's ex-boyfriend suspended from his ceiling, having obviously been killed by the hair. Overall, I don't think this is a bad idea for a story. I always kind of like horror tales that feature a jilted lover seeking revenge from beyond the grave. But like I said, the title is so much of a spoiler that it kind of ruins the experience. Or at least it did for me. It doesn't help either that the plot of this story is basically the same as an old Simpsons Treehouse of Terror episode. Remember the one where Snake comes back from the grave through his hair and tries to get revenge on the men who sent him to the electric chair? Tell me that's not the same plot. Episode 6 includes the stories Mold and Library Vision. Mold is a simple tale about a man who builds himself a new house, only to be assigned a position overseas. He ends up renting the place to an old teacher of his, but when he returns home a year later, he finds the place a complete disaster with trash everywhere and a strange kind of mold growing all over the place. At the end of the episode, the main character finds the bodies of the teacher and his family absorbed into the mold, and the main character ends up turning into mold as well. The end. It's a simple tale and definitely not one of the worst, but the one question I was asking myself through the entire thing was, why doesn't this guy just get a hotel room or something? I mean, when he returns from overseas, the whole place looks like the house from Resident Evil 7, and he just sets up shop among the filth. His younger brother even agrees to let the main character stay at his place, but for some reason the guy never does. He just chooses to remain in his house and becomes mold. It's very confusing. Library Vision is a bit better. This is one of the few stories that I've actually read, and while it's definitely not one of the scariest, I do think it's one of Junji Ito's better works. The story follows a newlywed woman named Coco, whose husband is obsessed with the enormous library he inherited from his parents. Shortly after his marriage to Coco, his mind begins to deteriorate as he sees ghostly visions of the books on his shelves. That's basically the entire story, which ends with a fire breaking out and the whole house burning, along with the library. From what I can recall, the manga version was actually way better than the anime, just because the story is told much more clearly and it's a lot more understandable from scene to scene. As I mentioned, it's really not that scary, but it does have a very unique, dreamlike quality and some very strange concepts that help to keep things interesting. Unfortunately, the anime adaptation of the story doesn't explain things very well, so we just kind of get jerked from scene to scene, watching a confusingly vague tale about a man's descent into madness, with some possible supernatural elements tossed in. Not the best this series has to offer, but certainly not the worst. Episode 7 only contains one story called Toontown. This was one of my favorites because, despite some roughness around the edges, it actually has a pretty interesting and suspenseful plot. The story begins with two siblings, a brother named Tsuyoshi and his sister named Kaoru, driving into the mountains to visit a friend. On their way, they accidentally hit a young girl and kill her. The pair put the body in the car, initially planning to take the girl to the hospital, but when it becomes clear that she's dead, Tsuyoshi starts talking about finding a place to hide the body. Unfortunately, the two have already reached their mountain destination at that point. With no other choice, they leave the body in the trunk of Tsuyoshi's car and continue on to their friend's house. The friend, whose name is Izumi, takes them on a small tour of the town, which proves to be crammed with tombstones. Izumi explains that in this town, when a person dies, their body transforms into a tombstone in the place where the corpse falls. Now, the idea of people dying and their bodies turning into tombstones is a little bit silly, but it definitely adds some tension to the story as Tsuyoshi and his sister realize what this might mean for the body in their trunk. And things really start to heat up a little later that day when Izumi tells them that her younger sister went for a walk in the mountains that afternoon and is late getting back. So yeah, these two characters accidentally killed their friend's younger sister. When the dead girl fails to return, a search is organized and Tsuyoshi and his sister have no choice but to join in the effort and pretend to look for the girl. In the end, the two siblings find an old well that they're able to ditch the body in and quickly leave town. The episode ends with Tsuyoshi turning to stone while his sister looks on, sobbing and apologizing for what they've done. The real strength of this episode lies in the suspense. I know this might be kind of a weird comparison to make, but it reminded me a bit of the beginning of the film Psycho. In case you haven't seen it, Psycho opens with a woman who steals a huge sum of money from her employer and then goes on the run. During this sequence, you as a viewer might not agree with the actions the character has taken, but as she continues on her journey and you see her coming face to face with the police, you definitely feel the tension and fear that she's experiencing. It's a similar situation with Toontown. Throughout the story, you see the characters making worse and worse decisions and only digging their own graves, so to speak. But you can also see what prompts them to make those decisions, and the end result is such a horrible mess that you can't look away. I think, too, that the pacing of this episode is a huge part of what made it work. As we've seen, a lot of the episodes in this series are comprised of two stories, and that tends to result in kind of rushed pacing. But since episode 7 only contains Toontown, there's enough time to really build up the siblings' crime and the mystery of the town. So yeah, I had a fun time with this one. Episode 8 is another two-parter. It gives us Layers of Terror and The Thing That Drifted Ashore. Layers of Terror is probably the grossest story in this collection. The tale involves a mother and her two daughters who get into a horrible car accident on the way home from a memorial service. Before the accident, we see the mother doting on one of the girls, Reimi, obviously favoring her because she's the prettier of the two. The mother says that she wishes she could hold 2-year-old Reimi again because she was so cute. Fast forward to after the accident, and this is where things start to get pretty weird. As it turns out, the only one who was seriously hurt was Reimi. But the attending doctor tells Reimi's mother that her body is managing to heal itself. He explains that for some medically mysterious reason, Reimi's entire body is made of skin. He states that her anatomy seems to function like that of a tree, with the skin pushing outward in rings. Reimi's mother then asks the doctor if Reimi's childhood body could still be buried inside of her beneath the outer rings. So, remember how earlier in the episode the mother wished that she could hold Reimi as a 2-year-old child again? Yeah, I think you can see where this is going. Reimi's mother ends up peeling back all of Reimi's skin layers to try to find 2-year-old Reimi again, but suffice it to say things don't end up turning out the way she hoped. And I'm just going to move on from here because, like I said, things get pretty gross. The next story in this episode, titled The Thing That Washed Ashore, is one of the shortest in the collection, but also one of the more effective ones. It begins with a monstrous sea creature washing up on a beach, which draws the attention not only of the public, but of several marine biologists as well. As the creature begins to rot, the surrounding crowd notices a huge number of human bodies trapped within the decomposing corpse. The marine biologists decide to cut the creature open, expecting to find the victims dead. But instead, when the bodies spill out of the creature's stomach, the crowd is horrified to find that all of them are still alive. As it turns out, the victims managed to survive for years within the creature's digestive system by feeding off of the nutrients within. Grotesquely, however, the process changed the victims into mindless parasites with no memory of their former humanity. The episode ends with a shot of the deep ocean, revealing another creature just like the one that washed ashore. We see that its body is also filled with parasitic humans, hinting that an entire race of these strange fish creatures is inhabiting the ocean depths. Like many people, I watched Jaws one too many times as a kid, and now I'm terrified of the ocean. So I think that's why I found this episode so effective. It does a good job of playing on the fear of the deep sea, so if you share my phobia, you might also like this episode. The story actually kind of reminds me of a creepypasta I came across once called I Dove to Depths Uncharted. They should have stayed that way. It's a story about 2 divers who encounter something horrible far below the ocean's surface. I won't give any spoilers away, but both stories have a similar vibe. Episode 9 gives us our first and only Tomie episode called Tomie's Photos. This is hands down my favorite story in the entire collection. I love Tomie as a horror icon, and I'm really glad that the series creators gave an entire episode to this story because it really allowed the writers to flesh out the characters and the bizarre events that unfold. This is also one of the few stories in this collection that I've read, and honestly, from what I remember, I think this episode holds up pretty well when compared to the manga version. Our story begins at a high school where a young girl named Tsukiko apparently spends her time taking pictures of male students in order to sell them to the girls. Unfortunately for her, this act ends up being against school rules. Tomie in this episode is also a student, as well as the leader of the school's disciplinary committee. Drunk on power, she lures Tsukiko into a trap, fooling her into taking pictures of Tomie while admitting to her crimes, all in front of a teacher. This ends up getting Tsukiko suspended from school. However, when she gets the pictures she took of Tomie developed, they've all come out with mysteriously monstrous features. Tsukiko decides to get her revenge by spreading the pictures all over school, and when Tomie finds out what she's done, she hatches a plan to have her goons kill Tsukiko in retaliation. Yamazaki, the boy Tsukiko has a crush on, warns her about Tomie's plan and helps her find a hiding place where Tomie's goons can't find her. While they're hiding, Tsukiko begins to confess her love for Yamazaki, but as it turns out, he was working for Tomie the whole time, and he tries to strangle Tsukiko. She manages to escape and heads home. But shortly afterward, Tomie manages to get into her house and starts acting all friendly, obviously trying to lure Tsukiko into a false sense of security. Her plan fails, however, and Tsukiko begins hurling insults at her, calling her sick and a monster. This enrages Tomie, and as all of this is happening, we hear Yuki Hayashi's Tomie theme slowly building in the background. And I have to say, the music is woven in extremely well with the events happening on screen. It starts off with a few low, tense strains as Tsukiko begins getting under Tomie's skin, and as Tomie's anger boils to the surface, the music swells along with her rage. Just when her emotions are reaching their crescendo, however, Tomie falls to her knees and begins screaming about a pain in her head. Tsukiko initially believes that Tomie is faking being sick until she sees an eye sprouting from the back of Tomie's head. Before long, Tomie's screaming draws the attention of her goons, who've apparently been keeping watch outside this whole time. They rush into the apartment, and by the time they reach her, the eye on Tomie's head has developed into a kind of proto-face. Tomie begins shrieking at the boys to remove it and burn the growth, and so they get a knife and just start chopping away at it. But, because this is Tomie we're talking about, the boys end up getting a little carried away and they chop her entire head off. Once they realize what they've done, they turn on Tsukiko, trying to get rid of the only witness to their crime. However, just as they're about to kill her, they hear Tomie's voice screaming at them once more to remove the growth. They turn to see that the voice is actually coming from the growth this time, and that it's yelling at them to remove Tomie's original head before it wakes up. The growth shrieks at them to hurry, so the boys grab the head and rush out of the apartment, abandoning Tsukiko with Tomie's decapitated body. And the episode ends with Tsukiko seeing Tomie's headless corpse crawling to its feet and stumbling out of the apartment, a new head already taking form at the stump of its neck. Like I said before, I actually really liked this episode. It's not perfect by any means, but the horror elements in it are well built up and extremely well executed. It's also just a great little Tomie story. It did occur to me while I was watching that those who aren't already aware of Tomie and her mythos, I guess you could say, would probably be pretty confused by this one. The episode doesn't really explain much about who and what Tomie is, or even really how she's able to affect the men around her. But then I remembered that this series is called Junji Ito Maniac, so presumably it's meant for, Junji Ito maniacs. I wouldn't suggest this story as an introduction to the character, but if you're already a fan, this is probably one of the better ones. Alright, moving on to episode 10. This is another two-parter, including the stories Unendurable Labyrinth and The Bully. To be completely honest, I found Unendurable Labyrinth to be much more confusing than scary. The story opens with two characters who get lost while out on a hike. While they're trying to find their way, they come across a group of ascetic monks who invite them to stay at their temple for the night. With no other option, our protagonists take them up on their offer and spend the evening participating in temple activities like meditation. Just as they're settling down to sleep, however, they meet a girl named Aya who tells them that her brother disappeared after joining the temple sect. She confides that she's come to the temple undercover to see if she can find out what happened to her brother. During this explanation, she tells our two protagonists that the sect practices something called Nyujo, or Buddhist mummification. Apparently the practice involves being mummified and buried alive. Aya specifically mentions that the act is illegal, which got me wondering, is this actually a real thing? So I looked into it a bit, and yeah, this actually is real. I mean, kind of. There did used to be a practice of intentional starvation and mummifying monks alive in certain sects of Buddhism. So there you go. Sometimes horror can be educational, I guess. Our two protagonists decide to help Aya in her search for her brother, and the trio follows a group of monks out of the temple and into a hidden underground chamber behind a statue in the forest. Aya leads the way into the chamber, and this is where things start to get confusing. Aya does end up finding her brother, who's been mummified alive with a number of others from the sect. Her two companions start panicking at the sight of the monks' mummified bodies all around them, so Aya tells the pair to leave her alone with her brother. They do so, and I think the idea is supposed to be that they end up getting lost on their way back. But we don't really see that much of the underground chamber except for one or two long, straight corridors. So it's kind of confusing at first. Basically, the story just ends with us being told rather than shown that these characters are lost in some kind of underground labyrinth. And it turns out that all of the mummies around them are still alive, watching them wander through the chamber. And that's it. Honestly, I think this story had a lot of potential with the whole Nyujo idea being based on a real practice, but the execution just left a lot to be desired. I've not read Unendurable Labyrinth, so I don't know if the manga version was better executed than the anime, but based on what's included in this series, the story just isn't that cohesive or compelling. Things do get a little better in The Bully, though. This story has an extremely simple premise. A girl named Kuriko is told to play with a neighbor boy named Naoya, who's several years younger than her. But instead of playing with him normally, she becomes a sadistic bully, doing everything she can to torture and torment him. Fast forward to about a decade later, and the pair end up running into each other again. Naoya surprises Kuriko by telling her that he treasures the memories from the past, and that he was always in love with her. At this point, Kuriko already has a man, but after hearing Naoya's confession of love, she decides to ditch the guy she's with, and she and Naoya end up getting married. Fast forward a few more years later, and Kuriko is raising their son alone, having been abandoned by Naoya. The story ends with Kuriko realizing that Naoya never loved her, but only ever pretended to in order to enact his revenge. She copes with this by dressing up like she did as a child and dragging her son to the park, intent on torturing him the same way she used to torture his father. Like I said, it's a simple premise, but effective. It's disturbing, but not in the way Junji Ito's stories usually are. There's nothing supernatural going on, nothing gory, just a very unnerving tale about a sadistic bully who loves tormenting children. And that's definitely part of the reason why I don't really like this one. It's not that the story is poorly told, actually the opposite is true. The story was a little too effective and disturbing for me, considering the horror involves even minor violence against children. so I guess kudos to Junji Ito for that. Unfortunately, we now have to move on to the second to last episode in this series, which includes the stories Allie and Headless Statue. Allie is another fairly simple one. A university student named Ishida rents a room at a boarding house. Shortly after he moves in, however, he starts hearing ghostly voices at night. Eventually, he comes across a hidden entrance to a closed-off alley and heads down to investigate. He finds a trapdoor with some bodies hidden inside and tries to flee, but while he's trying to climb back out of the alley, someone comes at him with a knife, causing him to fall and presumably gravely wound himself. As it turns out, the attacker was Shinobu, the daughter of the boarding house owner, who begins confessing to him that she's murdered 5 or 6 people, including her own father, and stashed their bodies in the chamber under the trapdoor. She announces that the alley is her own private playground, but that she never goes there at night because that's when the ghosts of her victims come out. After her confession, she notices that Ishida is unconscious and heads down to the alleyway herself. However, the rope that she uses to climb down ends up being cut, and the story ends with Shinobu trapped in the alleyway as night falls, the spirits of her victims becoming restless in the dying light. So the story has kind of a Tales from the Crypt, you reap what you sow vibe. I'm pretty sure the idea too is that Shinobu's mother was the one who cut the rope, having suspected what her daughter was up to. All in all, it is a fairly creepy little story with some disturbing ideas, but not the most memorable in the bunch. It's definitely better than Headless Statue, though. Headless Statue is a story about an artist who creates a bunch of headless statues for an exhibit. However, shortly before the exhibit is to take place, the artist is found dead with his head removed. It turns out that all of the statues he created are coming to life and they want heads, so they start hunting people down and stealing theirs. There really isn't that much else to say about the story. The premise is very simple, and the execution unfortunately comes across as a lot more goofy than creepy. Also, I can hardly show anything of this episode here because just about every shot includes either decapitated heads or naked statues with fully exposed bodies, so not very YouTube friendly. Moving on to the last episode in the series, we get another two-parter with The Whispering Woman and Soichi's beloved pet. The Whispering Woman is a tale about a girl named Mayumi who's suffering from a weird mental illness that makes her cripplingly indecisive. Her father, concerned for her future, hires a sort of nanny named Mitsu to help direct Mayumi through her day-to-day life. The nanny turns out to be extremely effective, if a little creepy. Mayumi's father does some digging into her background and finds that she's living in a horrible situation with an abusive boyfriend. He considers intervening on Mitsu's behalf, but ultimately decides not to do anything since Mitsu is performing so well with Mayumi and he doesn't want to rock the boat by causing any change in Mitsu's circumstances. Unfortunately, before long, Mitsu's boyfriend ends up killing her. Afterward, Mayumi begins behaving strangely. Even though Mitsu isn't around anymore, she acts as though nothing has changed and Mitsu is still by her side. The story ends with Mayumi stabbing Mitsu's boyfriend to death, claiming that Mitsu told her to do it. So, much like Long Hair in the Attic, The Whispering Woman is a story about an ex-lover seeking revenge from beyond the grave. I don't have much to say about the story except that I really enjoyed it and I think it's one of the better executed stories in the collection. It's only about 10 minutes long, but because the premise is so simple, there's just enough time to flesh out the characters and the mystery surrounding Mitsu to make the ending effective. The last story that we get in this series is Soichi's beloved pet. This is one that I've read, and I think it's one of my favorite Soichi stories. In this tale, Soichi's sister finds a stray cat and decides to take it home and keep it. At first, Soichi and the cat don't get along at all, but Soichi places a hex on it, and soon the cute little kitten is behaving like a cat from hell. It starts clawing up the house, shedding all over the place, and dragging all sorts of weird bugs into the house. At one point, Soichi even claims that the cat has drug up an insect from hell. The episode ends with Soichi's curse on the cat backfiring as it bites him and causes the curse to manifest as a near-deadly burst of electricity. As I said, this is probably one of my favorite Soichi stories, but the manga version was definitely better than the anime. In fact, if I remember correctly, the story actually got a laugh out of me the first time I read it. The anime, though, not so much. Maybe it has something to do with the way your brain processes information on the page as opposed to the screen, but it feels like something was lost in translation here. And to be clear, I don't think this is a bad adaptation necessarily, but the editing and pacing just feel a little clunky, and the comedic payoff at the end falls a little flat. And with that, we've reached the end of the series. And man oh man, has this been quite the ride. I feel like I've been kind of negative about the show overall, and while I do stand by my opinions, I actually had a pretty enjoyable time with this series. Is it perfect? Obviously not. but I did have a good time binge watching it, and there's just something fun about spending time in the world of Junji Ito for a while. As I mentioned at the beginning of the film, the budget was obviously a bit higher for this series than it was for the 2018 Junji Ito collection. And while the episodes aren't always effective, they do at least capture something of the bizarre vibes of Junji Ito's world. There are even a few little Easter eggs hidden throughout the series. For example, in the story Alley, we see Ishida reading a book called Hell of Thorns. This is one of the same books from Library Vision and one of the ghostly apparitions who appears to the main character from that story. Likewise, in Ice Cream Bus, we see two characters watching a TV special featuring an idol named Terumi Fujino. This is the same idol from the story Hanging Balloon, whose death kicks off the creepy balloon apocalypse. I really appreciated these small details, especially during my second viewing of the series. But, as always, that's just my opinion. What did you guys think of Junji Ito Maniac? Were you disappointed by the show, or did you manage to find some enjoyment in it like I did? I'd love to know in the comments. Until then, see you next time.